Thank you all for joining us today for a new session of the GRADE-CE webinar series. The GRADE-CE webinar series serves as a platform for the GRADE-CE network members to share experience and expertise in evidence synthesis and to learn about potential collaboration. My name is Zahra Saad. I'm a research assistant at the GRADE-CE Secretariat, and I will be moderating the session today. So before we begin, and if you are using the GoToWebinar for the first time, as you might have noticed, you are automatically muted. So if you would like to submit any comment or ask any question, please use the tab on the right. Or if you would like to comment or address any question to our presenter directly, you can use the raise your hand button and we can unmute you. Today's session is about stakeholder engagement and evidence synthesis webinar series. And our presenters today are Neal Haddaway and Heather Munthe-Kaas. So Dr. Neal Haddaway is a senior research fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute. His main research interests are around the production and use of environmental evidence in decision-making by improving the transparency, efficiency, and reliability of evidence synthesis as a methodology. He is the co-creator of ROSES, Reporting Standards for Systematic Evidence Synthesis, a set of rigorous standards for reporting the conduct of systematic reviews and maps in environmental topics. Neal also coordinated and guest edited the CEE special series of papers on stakeholder engagement and evidence synthesis in the journal Environmental Evidence. And our next presenter is Heather Munthe-Kaas. She's a researcher at the Norwegian Institute of Public Health. She has experience in conducting reviews on the effect of social welfare and public health interventions. And through this work, she has engaged closely with decision makers. She is one of the co-founders and co-convenors of the GRADE-CERQual working group. Thank you again, Neal and Heather, for being with us today. The floor is all yours. We will start our presentation with Heather.
Thank you, Sarah. Welcome, everybody. I'm just going to set up my slides here. I am going to give a very brief introduction to the transfer approach. Many of you have probably not heard of it since it's a relatively new approach. We published the paper describing it in January, but we've been using it and developing it for 3 years now. So this is, again, a very, very brief introduction to the transfer approach. If you want more information on it afterwards, you can go to the paper, or I always can provide private training sessions to review teams or institutions. My colleague Heidi Nyckeby has helped me create the transfer approach, and she was unable to join the call today though. So the transfer approach is guidance for review authors on how to improve collaboration with decision makers in order to systematically and transparently consider and assess the transferability of review findings to a review context. Often we are talking about a global context, but for commissioned reviews, we're often talking about a more local context. We define transferability factors as a subset of effect modifiers that are systematically present in a defined context, and they're hypothesized to influence the transferability of review findings to that context. And when I say transferability, you could say indirectness or generalizability. We've just decided to use one word. But if you were interested in going through the terminology there are many papers that discuss it. So an assessment of transferability then is whether there's substantial difference between the context of the review question and the context of the studies contributing data to the review finding with respect to a prior identified characteristics. So far I have only discussed transferability, and we haven't got to the stakeholder part, but that is coming, I promise, as a critical part to the transfer approach. So where we see the transfer approach is not a lot of additional work to a normal systematic review process. If you look at the diagram presented on the screen right now, in most cases, you'll establish the need for a systematic review, either through commission or maybe a review team takes the initiative. The figures on the left, the green and purple women, the purple are the stakeholders, if you will, or you might want to call them decision makers, people who will use the research, at least the findings from a review. The green women are researchers. So often after you've identified that you need to have a systematic review on a topic, you'll go and do a bit of a scoping search and find out some details about it. And the next stage within the transfer process is to collaborate very closely with stakeholders to refine the review question. Many review teams, if not most, are already doing this. The transfer approach provides guidance in order to do this systematically. And that will be the theme throughout here. Many of review teams are already engaging with stakeholders, but the transfer approach is providing a method for doing it very, very systematically, so that regardless of your background, if you have an environmental background or a feminist approach or a medical doctor background, you should approach your engagement with stakeholders in the same way. So in this meeting, you refine the review question with the stakeholders, identify and prioritize transferability factors, and define characteristics of your review content. I would love to go into more details about these stages, but just briefly, identifying and prioritizing transfer factors could be as simple as looking at a review question and thinking, how does this intervention work differently in our local context than it might in another? And you might ask something like, am I likely to have concerns if all of the research in this review comes from a context that is more politically free, has different geographical context, has different social context than my own context. And we have a number of templates that help us to go through that. The next part is to conduct a normal systematic review, number 3. The only difference here with the transfer approach is that you also include data extraction on the data extraction form. You extract data related to the transferability factors that you identified with the stakeholders. The last part is that you develop a transfer overview of included studies, assess the transferability of the review studies, and what we really hope to do with transfer is to support a GRADE or GRADE-CERQual assessment of indirectness or relevance in a systematic and transparent way. So when people using the GRADE or GRADE-CERQual approach at the end of a systematic review are able to see why or why not you've graded up or down for relevance or indirectness. So this is just another way to look at the transfer approach. And this is what at the bottom we would think a transferability assessment looks like and how it would support an indirectness assessment. I can come back to that. So the transfer approach toolkit is the review question form. And as I said, all of this done is in collaboration with stakeholders. And just to specify, stakeholders, like I said, are decision makers. In some cases, we've even been able to use practitioners and end users of interventions. So on a study looking at the effect of interventions for mentoring, the effect of mentoring for immigrants, we've contacted people who provide mentoring services, people who organize the mentoring services, people in the government who were providing funding for to the institutions, and all of those individuals were able to participate in this discussion. This is the, like I said, this is the form where we figure out together what the PICO is. And the benefit of doing it this way is you don't have to go back and forth so much with your stakeholders to clarify terms or, I mean, a very common example within public health and social welfare interventions could be age. For example, if you're doing a study on youth or children, some cultures would define children as 0 to 18. In Norway, it's 0 to 23. And you hate to get to the end of a review and find out that you misinterpreted or talked past each other when defining the PICO. This is a screenshot of our conversation guide. It is not meant for you to be able to see it, unfortunately, right now, but it is included in the article that I have the citation to at the end of this. But you might be able to see on here that we have different types of transferability factors and with questions that you would go through with your stakeholders in a meeting. For example, you might say to them, would you be concerned if data this type of subgroup analysis. So as you can see, this ends up being a subgroup analysis just on transferability, like specifically those kind of factors, and the factors are identified with beforehand. The way that you would present that is to then put it into a table. As you can, if you have length of homelessness is the transferability factor. In Norway, we have a lot of homeless people who have lived on the streets for a very long time. We have minor concerns about this transferability factor of this review finding to our context because it shows a slight difference in contexts where where people have had lower versus longer times homeless. We would do that for the other transferability factors as well. This one was quality of usual services. We might have minor concerns because when the intervention was presented in context, it was a slightly reduced effect. And we know in Norway we have good high quality services generally. But all of the studies came from cold contexts, and anybody who knows Norway knows that it's very cold here most of the time. So we would have no concerns for climate and that the transferability of the findings with respect to the climate transferability factor. Overall, we would have minor, and no concerns, which would lead us to overall moderate concerns, as you can see from the table. We would hopefully use this to back up our grade table, where we would say that we had serious concerns because, as you can see from number 2 underneath the table, minor concerns regarding differences between the studies and the review context with respect to length of homelessness and quality of usual services, but no concerns regarding differences between studies and review context related to climate. Like I said, this is a very, very short, I usually spend an hour on this presentation, but there's one takeaway message here. It's the importance of engaging with the stakeholders and collaborating from the very beginning of the systematic review process in order to ensure that you're considering the most relevant transferability factors. You're considering their context and you're not making any assumptions on their behalf. And this is done by treating them as experts in their own right at the beginning of the review process. It happens far too often in my experience where stakeholders are invited to a meeting and are quite passive because it's not necessarily quote unquote their area of expertise to do a systematic review. But when it's put into light that their area of expertise is in fact the topic and you're the methodologist, but you're equals trying to work towards the most relevant and useful research outcome, this is a very useful tool to make it systematic and transparent for all. Zara, are we holding questions off until the end?
In case anyone has any question, please feel free to ask. Okay, so we can continue with the presentation now, and maybe we can leave the questions till the end.
Great, thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Zara, and thanks very much, Heather. That was really interesting to hear more about the transfer approach, having read about it a couple of weeks ago in that paper. So what I'm going I think I just muted myself again, sorry. What I'm going to talk about now is a really brief overview following on from Heather's really great presentation there on the webinar series that Gessi arranged, I think that started at the beginning of last year, that focused on stakeholder engagement in systematic reviews. So just by way of introducing myself, hopefully you can see my screen. Just check, yeah. So as Zara introduced, my name is Neal Haddaway. I'm based at the Stockholm Environment Institute. I have a background in environmental sciences, and my involvement in stakeholder engagement has been from the perspective of environmental management and conservation. But I've worked with some really amazing people who have experience in stakeholder engagement across different sectors, different disciplines. And so we wanted to put together some resources on how to engage and some notes and reflections on experiences of engaging stakeholders, and to make them public and share them with people so that there could be some shared learning. So we came up with the idea for a special series of papers that were started in the journal Environmental Evidence. So we have this special series that is actually ongoing. We're still accepting papers if people have ideas for comments or methods, papers in stakeholder engagement, or even papers talking about results of stakeholder engagement activities. It's in the journal Environmental Evidence, which is a journal that's organized by the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence, which is the environmental allegory of Cochrane and Campbell. And the idea of this special series, as I said, was to sort of consolidate knowledge on stakeholder engagement, because we were aware that in general, reporting on stakeholder engagement and approaches to engaging with stakeholders were very different and variable across different systematic reviews. So we wanted to try to put together some advice on how to approach it in a best practice way. We then took the vast majority of those papers from a stakeholder engagement series and put them into a book, just to make that easier to read. And that book is open access and freely available on the website of Mistra EVM project, which is evm.se. I think the link is at the end of the presentation. And the first edition of that book was produced in 2018. And in addition, we've put together a website that has all of these papers, the book, the webinars from the GESI webinar series, and some other really useful resources. So we wanted this to sort of be a one-stop shop for anybody interested in stakeholder engagement and evidence synthesis. So we're really open to putting more information on there as well. And that website link is at the end of the presentation as well. And then the other thing that we wanted to do, excuse me, was to build a community of practice of people interested in conducting and learning and sharing experiences around stakeholder engagement to really push forwards practices of stakeholder engagement and reporting of stakeholder engagement in evidence syntheses. So this is a list of all of the papers in the GESI webinar series. I'll go through each of these one by one, but there's a really diverse range of commentaries, of experiences, of opinions, and of methods and suggested best practices in stakeholder engagement. Some of those are perspectives from the field of environment, some are from social welfare, international development, policy, and environmental communication or science communication. So there's a big spread of topics here. The first paper was one that I was involved with. Excuse me. It was a framework for stakeholder engagement during systematic reviews and maps, and we focused on environmental management. And so each of these papers that I'm presenting is the topic of a GESI webinar. So hopefully some of you will have seen them. If not, I really encourage you to watch them. So this paper in the webinar was talking about all available options that we were able to find in terms of stakeholder engagement methodology during a systematic review, right from identifying who to engage with, how to engage with them, how to keep them engaged, how to communicate with them afterwards, talking about processes like how to phase engagement, how to give acknowledgement, how to maintain anonymity, how to deal with conflict, and extracting methods from the literature, from a review of the literature, and involved a survey of experienced stakeholder, of people with experience of conducting stakeholder engagement in systematic reviews. It also includes what we found quite useful as a definition of stakeholder based on experienced systematic reviewers. Because as you've heard, Heather's talked about stakeholders as being policymakers or decision makers. Some people could be talking about end users or patients and carers, or it could be the general public or any kind of actor. So that in particular from this paper, we found, or we hoped might be quite useful. Another paper was one by my colleagues at SEI, Rasmus Klokke Larsen and Annika Nilsson, and they talked about producing knowledge and conflict, and how you can try to deal with conflict when you are synthesizing evidence and producing knowledge with the ideal endpoint of having constructive outcomes. And they have some really nice schematics on what the relationship between conflict and knowledge production and who owns that knowledge. So just sort of briefly going over these other papers. There was another one by our colleagues at the Africa Center for Evidence, Lorenz Lange et al. And in this paper, it was a really useful commentary on how engaging with stakeholders had made them think slightly differently about what defined rigor. So typically in systematic reviews, we'd be aiming for transparency, comprehensiveness, repeatability, and procedural objectivity, amongst other things. But in engaging in particular with the policymakers that they have networks with in South Africa, Lawrence and his colleagues were sort of challenged to think about how if you're trying to produce evidence for a policymaker, perhaps some of the evidence that you need to synthesize might not be publicly available, or some of the methods that you use, because you're driven by timeframes that are quite tight, might need to, or might, as a result of the timeframe, not be so repeatable. So their definition of rigor really changed from having engaged with stakeholders, and that's a really interesting read. I was involved in this paper as well with Jackie Eales and Angus Webb that was talking about thinking about training and capacity building through a stakeholder engagement lens, and how often when we're engaging with stakeholders, we're actually building capacity and building awareness about evidence synthesis. So for us, typically education and training in systematic reviews has been seen as a very, very distinct sort of pillar of what we do. And actually, if you sort of blend it a bit with stakeholder engagement, then you start to realize that there are loads of opportunities for capacity building when we engage with stakeholders, and we need to think quite carefully about how we do that. And then this paper by Magnus Land and his colleagues in Sweden talks about a 5-step approach for engaging with stakeholders in order to do the first stages of systematic reviews, where you're prioritizing and planning topics. And this is something that the Mr. EVM group in Sweden have spent a lot of time on. And so if you're thinking about how to build the scope of your review and to prioritize different topic areas, if you've got lots of possible questions that you might want to tackle, then this paper is really useful in having some suggested methods for dealing with that in a systematic way. And then Jess Taylor and her colleagues from Carleton University talk about their experiences in introducing stakeholders in Canada to systematic reviews in the field of environment, particularly in the field of fisheries. But it's a really interesting read in terms of how to go about telling people about the value of systematic reviews without overwhelming them with jargon, and also importantly making sure that their expectations are met when you finally get through to the systematic review stage, that you don't sort of make people expect too much through your promises of what a systematic review or a systematic map in the field of environment can do. And then Sandy Oliver and colleagues talk about looking at systematic reviews in a transdisciplinary way, and thinking about working with different people with lots of different skills and experiences from different disciplines, including stakeholders in that, in shaping the scope of systematic reviews and helping to interpret the findings by providing context. And so that's a really useful overview if you think that you're going to be working in a transdisciplinary project. Armin Spock and his colleagues, who have been working in a big project called GRACE, which has focused on GMO, genetically modified organisms, doing systematic reviews across topics within that field. They talk about their experiences in trying to have a very inclusive stakeholder engagement process in identifying topics and then prioritizing which questions they wanted to take through to systematic review. And in particular doing this in a very controversial, conflict-ridden topic of regulatory science and GMO. And then Alex Collins and her colleagues talk about engaging policymakers with systematic reviews, some of the challenges and solutions and lessons that they've experienced in working closely with, in this case with DEFRA in the UK, the Department for Environment, Farming and Rural Affairs, through a close networking of researchers with experience in evidence synthesis and an outward-facing group called the Joint Water Evidence Group, who were targeting evidence syntheses for policymakers within DEFRA. So that's a very interesting read for anybody interested in that sort of knowledge brokering and close working of evidence producers and evidence users in policy. Oh, there's one topic that I've forgotten to put up there, I'm afraid. One of the most popular, actually, working on storytelling, and that was Anneli Sundin, Carolyn Anderson and Rob Watt from the Stockholm Environment Institute, who worked towards a paper looking at the value of storytelling in evidence syntheses, and that although the traditional approach to thinking about storytelling might be a bit of a fear of anecdote, that actually by building a story, by using the outputs of evidence syntheses, you can produce a very powerful and emotive and influential communications package that will complement a systematic review. And they talk about the benefits of storytelling as a means of communication following on from systematic reviews. I'm so sorry to have omitted that one. But thanks very much. There are links here. The first link is the website link to the special series on stakeholder engagement and systematic reviews. You can also find that through the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence website. And the second link is the EVM website that has the open access book version of the same articles, just in a different format. So that's sort of an overview of the webinar series. Really encourage you to watch those webinars if you can, if you haven't seen them already. What Zara, Heather and I thought we'd do now was to move over to give you the opportunity to ask some questions, to prompt a bit of a discussion around stakeholder engagement and systematic reviews. In order to do that, I've got some questions that that might prompt you. So I just thought perhaps we could just run through those briefly. So the questions that we came up with were whether perhaps you have examples of successful stakeholder engagement, and if so, why do you think they were particularly successful in those cases that you can think of? Are there any challenges associated with engaging with stakeholders that you might want to ask about? If you've watched the series, what was your favorite presentation and why? Are there any aspects of stakeholder engagement that you think were missing from this series? And perhaps you'd like us to add in an extra paper or an extra webinar? And is there anything that we've stated through the series or in the presentations this morning that you particularly perhaps disagree with or think that there's another explanation for or a different slant on? And then what if you work in stakeholder engagement, has been your biggest challenge so far that you think might still need to be tackled. So I don't know if anybody has any questions so far, if anybody wants to raise their hand or ask a question in the chat.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you, Neal, for this very interesting session. It was definitely very informative. Please, as Neal mentioned, you can type in using the chat box to direct any comment or answer any of these questions, or you can use the raise your hand button and we can unmute you.
I think I might start off by answering one of my own questions, if that's all right. I think the biggest challenge that I've faced in our work with stakeholder engagement has been because our systematic reviews have taken quite a long time. We normally do 1 or 2 systematic reviews at the same time and work part-time on each one. So our projects typically take around 2 years. We can engage with stakeholders at the beginning, but often, particularly in policy, those people who have changed jobs by the time it comes to communication. And where they haven't, where it's the same people, I'm quite concerned about taking up too much of their time or sort of bombing their inbox with updates that don't show that much progress, perhaps. But I do want to keep them interested. So there's this trade-off between trying to keep people informed, being aware that they're involved in lots of other projects and have a lot else going on, and perhaps don't want to know every step of the process. So I don't know if anybody else has any reflections on that. How do you deal with keeping people engaged and not overwhelming people? Heather, I don't know if you have any reflections on that, or Zara.
I understand your concern, and I recognize the situation. I think, though, my perspective and the feedback I think I've gotten from a lot of stakeholders is that rather a little bit extra time up front than a review that's not completely what they were looking for, or the findings are not interpreted in the correct manner, like that we haven't taken their context into consideration, or that we talked past each other. So my experience has been, especially turnover of stakeholders is a challenge. And most recently, we just decided that we need to almost have the the startup meeting again when somebody takes over your project from the decision makers team. You need to have that whole conversation again, just to bring them up to speed on where you are, and making any assumptions is dangerous. And as far as the updating, it is this walking a balance between having your emails, just inundating them with emails and making sure they're up to date. And I think my expectations of them after they've input at the very beginning is that they don't have to respond to me, and I let them know that I'm open for whenever they would like to talk. But when I send them an email, they don't need to necessarily engage or come back to me, that unless there's a problem. I'll just continue as was decided. But it's a fine line for sure.
That's really nice. I really like that that idea of being open and saying that yeah, people don't need to feel like they have to respond, feeling quite guilty if I haven't responded that I get. So I think that's something I hadn't thought about, actually. That's a really nice approach. I also really like the transfer approach of thinking a priori about how transferable aspects of the review or the review as a whole would be for stakeholders or for different groups of stakeholders. I think there are a lot, maybe perhaps not a lot, but there are several cases where people have said to me in their systematic review projects that that they've gone to a lot of work and then at the end were criticized because they, people say, well, I can't do anything with that because it's global evidence and it doesn't apply to me. Or
way too often.
you haven't thought about the scope in this way, or the definition for that isn't one I agree with. I think I guess in a way it should be fairly obvious, but it's something that's not obvious, and it should really be carefully thought about. That's why I really enjoyed reading that paper on transfer.
Thank you. That's fine. And it is in direct response to an expressed wish from the people that we were engaging with, was that in fact, in one of the very first focus groups, we went through kind of a simulated exercise with transfer, and they said, yes, we would use time on this. We would actually give you 2 or 3 hours if it meant that we didn't have to have, you know, we weren't upset with the results at the end because they weren't what we, not just that the results weren't what they expected, but they weren't useful or relevant.
That also made me think about another challenge that we've had, or a comment that we've had. We started off thinking that what we really wanted to do was to have physical meetings to bring stakeholders together, so we could meet them in person, so that we could get the group together and ask everybody what their opinions and thoughts were, present at the same time. It was efficient, it was nice, it was social. And I think in many ways it is, but we also realized that what we were asking people to do is to give half an hour to an hour of their time coming to and going from the meeting, and then to sit there as a group. So their opportunity to speak to us was shared across a large group. And I think in some circumstances, not having a physical meeting with a large number of stakeholders, or a moderate number of stakeholders, and actually having individual phone calls or individual meetings is a lot more useful, even if it's perhaps not immediately more efficient. From their perspective, they get one-on-one contact with you instead of having to wait for their turn to speak. So that was something that has been a bit of a lesson for us, that in some cases we might think that having a physical meeting is best, but actually it might be counterproductive. I don't know if you felt the same thing.
We've actually had the opposite experience, but I understand what you're saying, and that's interesting, and I wonder if it just applies to different situations, because so one example is that we brought in stakeholders from a huge range, different kinds of decision makers, but also practitioners. I think we were 7 or 8 people total, and it was on an intervention that I might be alone here, but I often don't know the research topic beforehand because our research is commissioned. So it was on a topic related to psychology that I really wasn't familiar with. So I'd done a scoping, and we came to the meeting and we started talking, and the debate that happened during that meeting was invaluable. About halfway through the meeting, we were talking about the pros and cons of the different types of models. And I said, I just need a second, because I'm not sure, is model X the same as model Y? And they said, oh yeah, model X is just the name for it in America, but in Europe, we say model Y. And I said, well, in that case, we can stop here, because there was a systematic review published 2 weeks ago on the effect of model Y on your outcomes. And I'm not sure that that would have come up without a lot of Googling, many days of Googling, if I didn't have this debate that was happening between the different stakeholders. So essentially, I just translated the review findings into Norwegian and handed it over, and it saved us 9 months of work. And related to that was that we tried to do transfer via email, and it might work in the future, but we have some refinement to do. But we found that doing it via email, now we didn't do it over the phone or one-on-one, but not having that group dynamic, people were very hesitant to raise their hands and put forth the transferability factor, because everybody thought, well, I don't really know, I'm not really an expert on this. Whereas if you have people in a room, you start to gauge the level of the other quote-unquote experts, and you realize maybe you do have something to say, or somebody's comment sparks an idea in the back of your head. So I have actually found that the gathering of the minds, although logistically challenging, we're trying to do it via Skype in this next project. It can be logistically challenging, but it does have definite rewards if possible.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There are definitely projects as well that we've been involved with where our stakeholder engagement activities were set in the context of a much broader, complex issue. And that didn't only mean that we had to be careful about conflict, but we had to view our stakeholder engagement process as being valuable well outside of our systematic review project. So by bringing those people into a room, we had to act very carefully, but also realize that by bringing those people together to talk about something independent, we were potentially giving an opportunity to build trust. And we were, for me as a methodologist as well, I'm often not an expert in the subject area that I'm doing reviews in, but it meant that we're stepping into someone else's very personal area when we're dealing with stakeholder engagement. This is a much broader context, and by arranging a meeting in a subject area where those stakeholders are coming together, it's a potential for great opportunities in sort of working towards a community. But then on the flip side has huge risks associated with especially with topics where there's a conflict. So yeah, your comment about not being a subject expert is really interesting, because there's this whole nuance around expertise. You can be a systematic review expert, you can be a stakeholder engagement expert, you can be a subject expert, and you kind of need all of that to be able to sit within the wider context of the stakeholders who are affected by this issue in their daily lives, either in their work or in their personal life. It's really it's very interesting.
Absolutely. I think we're still open for questions if any of the attendees have any comments or questions. It doesn't have to be earth-shattering. No pressure.
We can continue to take questions by email or on Twitter afterwards as well, if you want to. Sorry about that.
I think we have a comment or question from Tamara Lutfi. Tamara, I just unmuted you.
Thank you, Zara. Hi, Neal. Hi, Heather. Thank you for this great webinar. It definitely helped me pick up where I left off with the past few for stakeholder engagements. It's definitely also interesting to see the different tools and to learn about the different ways you've addressed stakeholder engagement. I had a question actually for Heather with the transfer toolkit. I'm not sure if this was brought up earlier on whether the toolkit has been translated to different languages. And the second question would be on whether the time to complete a toolkit, assuming that you're working with one stakeholder at a time, whether that has been measured, or how much time do you assume it would take to go through all the items within the toolkit? Thank you.
Thank you for your question and your feedback. So the transfer toolkit is currently available in English and Norwegian. If anybody would like to translate, we are looking for volunteers, but this is a completely unfunded project. So it would be on a voluntary basis, unfortunately. So our experience thus far with transfer is that essentially a 1 3-hour meeting with between 2 and 8 stakeholders is sufficient to go through the PICO refinement and the conversation guide. More experienced review authors may get through it more quickly, as well as just building on what Neal said earlier, because it's really important. Stakeholders who are familiar with systematic reviews are also much more likely to kind of get the concept of what we're talking about with transferability. If the review team and the stakeholders have done at least one review before, they're more likely to understand the challenges that transfer is meant to address. And therefore the conversation guide goes a lot more quickly because you can be more detailed. So going through the conversation guide and the PICO refinement, yeah, it should be done within 3 hours. And then after that, it's merely braiding together or inserting transfer at the various relevant points. So in data extraction, and then to do a transferability assessment. This is not intended to be a lot more work for a review team. It is only intended to make the process of engaging with stakeholders systematic and transparent, so that at the end of a review, if I make a review for Norway and I write it in English and somebody from South Africa reads the results, they understand my grade indirectness assessment or my GRADE-CERQual relevance assessment. They understand the subgroup analysis and why we did them. I'm fully aware that maybe if you only invite Norwegian decision makers, you might not capture all of the transferability factors that might be relevant for other cultures. But we hope that you will capture the most important ones, because if they're first identified by an expert as being important in one context, they are likely to be identified in many contexts. But that aside, we still believe that it's better than nothing. So yeah, in short, it shouldn't take more than about 3 hours.
All right, thank you for that. That's great. So otherwise, thank you, Sarah, for still giving me some time. I just wanted to answer Neal about what was my favorite presentation in this series. For me, actually, the one-on-one storytelling, as it was the one different thing than what we usually do, or the one thing that we haven't yet tried within our work. And then for what has been your biggest challenge in your stakeholder engagement work, where, well, honestly, we've been planning for a stakeholder engagement with a systematic review for the past 8 months, but due to economic crisis and, instability, and currently Corona, and all these factors in Lebanon, we haven't been able to actually meet with the stakeholders at any time. So do you think that doing the exercises online, seeing the current situation, could actually be of similar benefit and impact than having those meetings live?
I think that's a really good question, and I think the world is possibly changing forever in a way that will make us need to think very carefully about these things. I think when you say online, I think there are probably different layers to that. So it's worth thinking about what the restrictions might be for someone to participate remotely. And that might be that they might not be able to be next to their computer for a sustained time when you're available. So if we're talking about engaging with people online, you're probably more wanting to think about ways to allow people to provide their feedback or their comments and concerns remotely. So being open to not only just having a sort of a webinar or a meeting that's at a particular point in time, but also allowing people to watch that at their leisure, and also to read a summary. So allowing people to choose the way that they want to engage with something depending on their own constraints. They might have very little time, they might not be able to use audio, they might have limited broadband, they might need to log on just for a few minutes and then log off and then log back on, so they might need to download or do things offline. So I think trying to take a sort of nuanced approach to what remote participation might look like as a basis is really important. Whether that would replace stakeholder engagement, I guess as you've heard from the discussion between Heather and I, that sometimes there are real benefits to having stakeholders in a room together. Whether you can replicate that online, I don't know. There are lots of sort of platforms available, and I'm sure new ones cropping up that will allow sort of a crude replica of physical meetings to be emulated online, like in the ability to have breakout rooms and approaches to whether you have people in a group just listening to a participation and they're all muted, or whether you put people into breakout rooms and ask people not to mute themselves, whether you ask people to use cameras so that you can have social cues as well as verbal cues, so see people nodding. We've been trying that at work and it's been quite successful. So I think in the absence of the ability to meet physically, then I think we're going to need to have these remote participation opportunities. And I think there are always stakeholders who just prefer you to pick up the phone as well and just have a chat, and that hasn't changed. But another increase sort of restriction is that people have potentially very strained social situations, so they might have even less time. So trying to be efficient and perhaps being even more careful about what we ask people to do in a systematic review is even more pertinent. Heather, I don't know if you've got anything to say.
No, I think I agree. I think we're forced to find new solutions, and face-to-face meetings just aren't logistically possible. Not now, and for many people, not really ever. So, but this is a larger human, how do you get people to stay engaged on? That's the challenge.
Yeah. But thanks very much for the question, Tamara. I see there's one question from Eliza. What's the best way to go about identifying and engaging stakeholders when the topic of a systematic review is purely of academic interest? If I could jump in and answer that first, I think it depends a bit what you want to get out of stakeholder engagement. So I'd say, is it legitimacy of the project? Is it to improve communication? Is it to improve the scope of the project? Presumably, if it's a purely academic project, then you're fairly happy with the scope and definitions already, but maybe you just want to double check. Where in the policy cycle or decision-making cycle does your topic fit? Is it well within a cycle of research, so it's not even going into policy, it's about research on research or how you do research, so then your stakeholders might only be academics and you might be a fairly good representation of them in your review group. But I think for me, it would go back to what you want to get from them, and what you think you can give them really affects your stakeholder engagement. Sometimes you see people not doing any stakeholder engagement because they feel it's such an academic topic, but often you also see people not doing stakeholder engagement because they think it's academic, but actually it does have an impact on people outside academia.
If I could also just add, because I think you're absolutely right, Neal. Just one more thing, though. I think first of all, I think you always have an audience. You always have a stakeholder. So if it's purely academic, probably your stakeholders are quite academic. And like Neal said, maybe you represent stakeholders more or less, but you have colleagues. And I think what differs here maybe is the degree of formality. So where we've had systematic reviews that are on the more academic, where it's more methodological development, we have engaged with our colleagues, but we haven't done it in such a formal way. We've tried to be systematic and transparent about it, but it's been much more collegial. So perhaps that's also a difference. You could just do it in a less formal way with more snowballing around your institution, for example.
Great. So we have a comment from Eliza. She says, thanks. Yes, I was thinking of treating colleagues as stakeholders.
And just to add to that, Eliza, if you're going to do that, I think it's perfectly legitimate to include that in the report. Not only legitimate, I think it strengthens even a methodological report because it shows that you have, it's up there with a systematic search. It shows that you've been trying to become aware of the situation as it is, and the end user context. At the end of the day, whatever you're doing a systematic review on, you want the results to be used, and they're almost always more useful if you've had stakeholder engagement from the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I just want to thank you, Neal and Heather, again for this great presentation and for the discussion. Thank you. As for the attendees who are with us today, just make sure you follow us for other sessions for the GRADE-C webinar series. And if you have any questions, please feel free to send us the question and we can direct you to Neal or Heather, or you can contact them directly.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Heather.